The dust settled thick around the Miller ranch that September morning, coating everything in a fine layer of prairie grit. Sarah Elizabeth Miller sat on the wraparound porch, her withered left leg tucked beneath the folds of her blue calico dress, watching the horizon where heat waves danced like spirits above the endless grassland. At 23, she had learned to find beauty in solitude, though it hadn't always been her choice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from the embroidery hoop balanced on her lap. 3 riders emerged from the shimmering distance, their silhouettes growing larger against the vast Montana sky. She recognized them immediately, the Hartwell brothers, all swagger and spurs, riding hard toward the Miller homestead with the kind of purpose that usually meant trouble. Her father's voice carried from inside the house, sharp and bitter as winter wind. "Ain't no point in them boys comin' around here again, Margaret. I told you what Doc Henderson said about Sarah's condition. Nobody wants a crippled bride, especially not ranchers looking to build strong families. Best we face facts." Sarah's needle stopped mid-stitch. The words hit her like they always did, a familiar ache that settled deep in her chest. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times over the past 5 years, ever since the accident that had crushed her left leg beneath a fallen beam during the barn fire. The injury had healed crooked, leaving her with a pronounced limp and a leg that would never bear full weight again. "Margaret," Miller's voice rose in quiet protest from the kitchen. "Joseph, she's our daughter. She deserves the same chance at happiness as any other girl her age." "Happiness?" Joseph's laugh was harsh. "You think I don't want my daughter to be happy? But look at her, Margaret. Really look at her. She can barely walk across the yard without that walking stick. How's she gonna manage a household, bear children, work alongside a husband on a ranch? These are practical matters, not fairy tales." The Hartwell brothers were close enough now that Sarah could make out their faces. James, the eldest at 28, rode with the easy confidence of a man who had never been refused anything. His younger brothers, Thomas and William, flanked him like loyal hounds. They had been calling on various eligible young women in the territory for months, and Sarah knew her name had been mentioned in those conversations, though never seriously. She gathered her embroidery and rose carefully from the wooden chair, favoring her good leg as she always did. The walking stick her father had carved from ashwood 3 years ago leaned against the porch rail, its surface worn smooth by her palm. She had grown to hate that stick almost as much as she needed it. The Miller ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, a testament to Joseph Miller's 25 years of back-breaking work and shrewd business sense. He had built it from nothing after arriving from Illinois with his young bride Margaret and a wagon full of dreams. The main house stood proud and white against the rolling hills, its green shutters and wraparound porch speaking of prosperity hard-won from the unforgiving frontier. But prosperity, Sarah had learned, didn't necessarily translate to happiness or acceptance. She made her way slowly around to the side of the house, where a small garden plot had become her domain over the years. Here, among the tomatoes and beans, the squash, and sunflowers, she had found purpose and peace. Her damaged leg might prevent her from riding the range or helping with the heavy ranch work, but her hands were strong and sure when it came to coaxing life from the soil, the sound of boots on the front porch told her the Hartwell brothers had arrived. Through the open kitchen window, she could hear her mother offering coffee and her father's gruff acknowledgement of their guests. The conversation that followed was predictable in its awkwardness. "Mighty fine morning, Mr. Miller," James Hartwell's voice carried clearly. "We were hoping to speak with you about a matter of some importance." "I reckon I know what brings you boys out this way," Joseph replied, his tone already defensive. "But I'm afraid you're wasting your time and mine." Sarah knelt carefully beside a row of late-season tomatoes, her movements deliberate and practiced. Over the years, she had developed her own techniques for managing tasks that others took for granted. A small wooden stool allowed her to sit while she worked, taking the weight off her weak leg. She had fashioned tools with longer handles too. Extend her reach, and had learned to work in a rhythm that accommodated her limitations without calling attention to them. "Now, Mr. Miller," Thomas Hartwell interjected, "we haven't even stated our business yet." "Don't need to," Joseph's voice grew sharper. "You boys have been making the rounds, looking for wives. Word travels fast in these parts. And I'm telling you straight, my Sarah ain't what you're looking for." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Sarah's hands stilled on the tomato vines, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had hoped, foolishly, perhaps that this conversation might be different, that someone might see past her physical limitations to the woman she was underneath. "With all due respect, sir," James Hartwell said carefully, "shouldn't that be Miss Sarah's decision to make?" Joseph's laugh was bitter. "You think I haven't watched my daughter's face every time a potential suitor rides away? You think I enjoy telling her the truth about her prospects? But I'll be damned if I'll watch her get her hopes up just so you. Boys can take a look and decide she ain't suitable for ranch life." Margaret's voice joined the conversation, barely audible through the window. "Joseph, please ... No, Margaret. These boys need to understand the situation. Sarah's leg was crushed in the barn fire 5 years ago. Doc Henderson did what he could, but she never walked normal again. She can't ride worth a damn, can't help with heavy lifting, can't even climb stairs without that walking stick. How's she gonna manage birthing children when the time comes? How's she gonna keep up with the demands of being a rancher's wife?" Each word felt like a physical blow. Sarah had heard her father's assessment of her limitations countless times, but it never got easier. The worst part was that much of what he said was true. She did struggle with physical tasks that other women her age managed with ease. She did tire more quickly and require accommodations that others didn't need, but she was also an excellent cook, a skilled seamstress, and could manage household accounts better than most men in the territory. She had read every book that passed. Through their small community, could discuss literature and current events with an intelligence that surprised visitors. She had a gentle way with animals and children, and possessed an inner strength that had been forged in the fires of adversity. None of that seemed to matter when measured against the harsh realities of frontier life. "Mr. Miller," William Hartwell spoke up, his voice younger and less certain than his brother's, "we've heard that Miss Sarah is accomplished in many ways. Perhaps her other qualities might." "Other qualities don't mend fences or birth calves," Joseph cut him off. "This ain't some parlor game, boy. Ranch life is hard on the strongest women. My Sarah deserves better than to be some man's burden." The word burden hit harder than the rest. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool earth beside the tomato plants, fighting back tears that had been threatening all morning. She understood her father's protectiveness, even if his methods were cruel. He had watched her struggle and suffer, had seen the disappointment in her eyes when potential suitors inevitably looked elsewhere. He was trying, in his rough way, to spare her further pain, but his protection had become a prison. The conversation on the porch continued, growing more heated as the Hartwell brothers pressed their case, and Joseph grew more adamant in his refusal. Sarah could picture the scene, her father standing rigid with his arms crossed, her mother wringing her hands at the kitchen table, the 3 young men shifting uncomfortably in their Sunday best. "We ain't asking for a quick decision," James Hartwell was saying. "Just a chance to pay our respects, maybe take Miss Sarah for a drive in the wagon, get to know her character." "Her character ain't in question," Joseph snapped. "It's her body. That's broken, and that ain't gonna change no matter how much courting you do." The words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and choking. Sarah heard the scrape of chairs being pushed back, the jingle of spurs as the men prepared to leave. The conversation was over, as she had known it would be. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Miller," James said with forced politeness. "But I want you to know that if Miss Sarah ever desires our company, she has only to send word." Joseph's response was a grunt that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal. After the Hartwell brothers had ridden away, Sarah remained in the garden, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of harvesting tomatoes. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the vegetable rows, and still she worked. Physical activity had always been her refuge from emotional pain, even if her range of motion was limited. Margaret appeared at the garden gate an hour later, her face drawn with worry and sorrow. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had always seemed larger to Sarah, a source of comfort and unconditional love in a world that often felt hostile. "Sarah, honey," she said softly, "I brought you some lemonade." Sarah accepted the glass gratefully, using the moment to compose herself. Her mother settled onto a small wooden stool beside her, her movements careful and deliberate. Margaret Miller was 47 years old, but frontier life had aged her beyond her years. Her hands were rough from household work, her face lined from sun and worry, but her eyes remained kind. "Your father means well," Margaret said after a long silence. "I know he does," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "But meaning well and doing well aren't always the same thing." Margaret nodded slowly. She had been having this internal struggle for years, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her daughter. Joseph's overprotectiveness came from a place of genuine care, but it was suffocating Sarah's chances at any kind of normal life. "There are other ways to find happiness," Margaret offered tentatively. "Teaching, perhaps. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that the school board is looking for someone to help with the younger children." Sarah's smile was sad but genuine. "I thought about that, but Papa would never allow it. He thinks it would be admitting defeat, putting me on display for the whole town to pity." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The two women sat in comfortable silence, watching bees work among the late-blooming flowers at the garden's edge. Sarah had always found peace in these quiet moments with her mother, times when words weren't necessary and acceptance flowed as naturally as breathing. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving at an easy lope across the grassland. Sarah shaded her eyes with her hand, trying to make out the figure. The horse was larger than most, a sturdy bay gelding that covered ground with the steady rhythm of a working animal, rather than the flashy gait of a show horse. As the rider drew closer, Sarah could see that he was a big man, sitting on his horse, with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He wore practical clothes, dark pants, a simple cotton shirt, and a well-worn hat that had seen many seasons of sun and rain. "I don't recognize him," Margaret sighed, squinting at the approaching figure. "Must be passing through." But the rider turned toward their gate instead of continuing down the main road. Sarah felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with apprehension. Strangers were rare in their corner of Montana, and those who did pass through usually had specific business in mind. The man dismounted at their gate with fluid grace, despite his size. He was indeed tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of solid build that came from years of physical labor. His movements were unhurried and economical. Speaking of someone comfortable in his own skin, Joseph emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of hoofbeats. His posture was immediately defensive, as it always was when strangers arrived. The frontier had taught him to be cautious of unknown quantities. "Afternoon," the stranger called, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice was deep and pleasant, carrying easily across the yard. "Name's Daniel Harrison. I'm looking for work, wondered if you might need an extra hand." Sarah found herself studying the man's face as he spoke with her father. He had strong features weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who smiled often. There was something gentle in his expression despite his imposing size, a quality that seemed at odds with his obvious physical strength. Joseph's response was predictably brusque. "Ain't hiring right now. Try the Thompson spread, about 10 miles south. They might have something." Daniel nodded easily, seeming unoffended by the quick dismissal. "Much obliged for the direction. Mind if I water my horse before I move on? It's been a long morning's ride." The request was reasonable, and frontier hospitality demanded accommodation even from those who weren't welcome to stay. Joseph gestured toward the water trough near the barn with visible reluctance as Daniel led his horse toward the water. His gaze swept across the property with the practiced eye of someone who understood ranch operations. Sarah noticed that his attention lingered on the garden where she and her mother sat. Though he made no move to approach or stare rudely, Margaret rose from her stool with a soft grunt. "I should see about starting lunch. Will you be coming in soon?" Sarah nodded, but her attention remained fixed on the stranger. There was something about him that intrigued her, perhaps the way he moved with such confidence despite being clearly travel-worn, or the polite way he had accepted her father's rejection without argument. Daniel allowed his horse to drink deeply, while he examined the animal's hooves and checked the cinch on his saddle. His movements were methodical and caring, the actions of someone who understood that his horse was more than just transportation. It was a partner and companion. Joseph watched from the porch, his arms crossed over his chest in his typical defensive posture. Sarah could see him cataloging every detail about the stranger, looking for signs of trouble or deception. Her father had always been suspicious of drifters, having heard too many stories of men who moved from place to place leaving problems in their wake. But Daniel Harrison didn't carry himself like a man running from something. His gear was well maintained, but not flashy. His horse was sound and healthy, and his manner was respectful without being obsequious. If anything, he seemed like exactly the kind of reliable help that any ranch owner would be lucky to find as. His horse finished drinking. Daniel straightened and touched his hat brim again in Joseph's direction. "Much obliged for the water. Your place looks prosperous. You've got good reason to be proud." The compliment was sincere without being fawning, and Joseph's rigid posture softened slightly despite his obvious intention to remain unfriendly. 25 years of work, he admitted grudgingly. "Built it up from nothing. Shows in every board and fence post," Daniel agreed. "Takes a special kind of determination to carve something like this out of raw prairie." Sarah watched the exchange with growing interest. Few people bothered to engage her father in conversation once he made it clear they weren't welcome. Most visitors took the hint and moved on quickly, eager to avoid confrontation. But Daniel seemed genuinely interested in the ranch and willing to acknowledge Joseph's accomplishments, perhaps sensing that he had pushed the bounds of hospitality as far as prudent. Daniel gathered his reins and prepared to mount. But as he swung up into the saddle, his gaze found Sarah across the yard. For just a moment, their eyes met and held. Sarah felt a strange jolt of awareness, as if something had shifted in the air around her. Daniel's expression was curious rather than pitying, interested rather than dismissive. He didn't look away immediately as most men did when they noticed her walking stick or awkward posture. Instead, he touched his hat brim in a small gesture of acknowledgement that seemed meant specifically for her. Then he was riding away, his horse's hooves raising small puffs of dust as they headed south toward the Thompson ranch. Sarah watched until he disappeared beyond the rise, surprised by how much she wished the encounter had lasted longer. "Seemed decent enough," Margaret observed, having returned from the house. "Big fellow, though. Don't see many men that size who move so easy." In the saddle, Sarah made a non-committal sound, still staring at the empty horizon. Something about Daniel Harrison lingered in her mind, the way he had spoken to her father with respect but not deference, the careful attention he had shown his horse, the brief moment when their eyes had met across the yard. For the first time in months, she found herself wondering what it might be like to have a conversation with someone who didn't know her history, who might see her as simply a woman rather than a damaged version of what she should have been. But such thinking was dangerous territory. Sarah had learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when disappointment followed as surely as winter followed autumn. Still, as she gathered her gardening tools and prepared to go inside, she couldn't quite shake the memory of kind eyes and a gentle voice saying her place looked prosperous. 3 days passed before Daniel Harrison appeared again at the Miller Ranch, this time leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and riding a different horse, a sturdy chestnut mare that moved with the easy gait of a seasoned trail animal. The morning mist still clung to the grassland when Sarah spotted him from her bedroom window, making his way up the winding path that led to their front gate. She dressed quickly in her best everyday dress, a soft green cotton that her mother had sewn with careful attention to hiding the irregularities in her left leg. The walking stick felt heavier than usual as she made her way downstairs, her heart beating with an anticipation she couldn't quite name. Joseph was already on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the approaching rider with the same wariness he showed all strangers. But there was something different in his posture this morning, less hostility, perhaps, and more curiosity. "Thought I told you to try Thompson's place," Joseph called out as Daniel drew near. Daniel dismounted with the same fluid grace Sarah remembered, though she noticed he moved more stiffly than before. "I did, sir. Spent the last 3 days helping them repair storm damage to their south pasture fence. Job's finished now, and they suggested I might check back with you." The explanation was straightforward enough, but Sarah caught the implication. The Thompson family were well respected in the territory, and their endorsement carried weight with neighboring ranchers. If they had recommended Daniel return to the Miller Ranch, it meant he had proven himself capable and trustworthy. Joseph's expression shifted slightly, the hard lines around his eyes softening just enough to suggest he was reconsidering his earlier dismissal. "What kind of work did you do for Tom Thompson?" "Fence repair mostly, but I helped birth a difficult calf and doctored a lame horse. Fixed a broken axle on their grain wagon, too." Daniel's tone remained conversational, neither boastful nor self-deprecating. "Mr. Thompson said you might have a use for someone with carpentry skills. Mentioned you've been talking about expanding your barn." Sarah saw her father's interest sharpen. The barn expansion had been a topic of discussion for months, but finding skilled help had proven difficult. Most of the available workers in the territory were either already committed to other projects or lacked the expertise needed for major construction. "Thompson's got a big mouth," Joseph muttered, but there was no real irritation in his voice. "What makes you think you can handle that kind of work?" Daniel gestured toward his pack mule. "Brought my tools along, if you'd care to take a look. Built most of a barn for a family outside Billings last spring, and helped raise a church in a mining camp before that." The offer to examine his tools was a smart move, Sarah realized. Any man could claim carpentry skills, but quality tools were expensive and told their own story about their owner's capabilities and character. Joseph set down his coffee cup and walked toward the pack mule, his merchant's eye already cataloging the contents of Daniel's gear. Sarah watched from the porch as her father examined hand planes, chisels, and measuring tools that showed the wear of regular use, but also the care of proper maintenance. "These are good tools," Joseph admitted grudgingly. He hefted a heavy framing, square, testing its balance and checking the accuracy of its angles against a porch post. "Where'd you learn the trade?" "My father was a carpenter back in Ohio. Started teaching me when I could barely hold a hammer properly." Daniel's voice carried a note of warmth that suggested fond memories. "After he passed, I worked with his partner for a few years before heading west. Been moving around since then, taking jobs where I can find them." The story had the ring of truth, and Sarah could see her father processing this information. A man with proper training and good tools was worth considering, especially if he came recommended by trusted neighbors. Margaret appeared at Sarah's elbow, drawn by the sound of voices. She had been kneading bread dough in the kitchen, and her hands still bore traces of flour despite her attempts to wipe them clean. "That's the fellow from the other day," she observed quietly. "Seems he made a good impression on the Thompsons." Sarah nodded, trying to appear casual despite her growing interest in the conversation taking place near the pack mule. There was something about Daniel Harrison that drew her attention, perhaps his quiet confidence or the respectful way he dealt with her father's suspicion. "I could offer room and board plus $30 a month," Joseph was saying. "But I'd expect more than just carpentry work. Ranch hands wear a lot of different hats around here." "That's fair," Daniel agreed. "I can handle most anything that needs doing: fence work, animal care, general repairs. Only thing I'm not much good with is cooking, but I'm willing to learn, if it comes to that." Joseph actually smiled at this admission, the first genuine expression of warmth Sarah had seen him show toward a stranger in months. "My wife handles the cooking, and she's particular about her kitchen, but there's plenty of other work to keep you busy." The negotiation continued for several more minutes, covering details about living arrangements, work schedules, and expectations. Daniel would take his meals with the family but sleep in the bunkhouse behind the main barn. He would be expected to work 6 days a week, with Sundays free unless emergency situations arose. Throughout the discussion, Sarah found her attention wandering from the practical details to observations about Daniel himself. He negotiated fairly but not aggressively, asking reasonable questions about the work without seeming to challenge Joseph's authority. His clothes were clean, but not fancy, practical rather than decorative. Most importantly, he carried himself with the bearing of a man comfortable with honest labor. When the handshake that sealed their agreement finally came, Sarah felt an unexpected flutter of excitement. Having another person around the ranch would provide a welcome change to their established routines, and she found herself curious about this quiet man who had earned her father's grudging respect in the space of a single conversation. "I'll show you to the bunkhouse," Joseph offered, already turning toward the barn complex. "We can discuss the barn expansion plans once you've had a chance to settle in." Daniel gathered his pack mule's lead rope and prepared to follow, but his gaze found Sarah on the porch before he moved away. Once again, their eyes met and held for just a moment, and once again Sarah felt that strange jolt of awareness. This time, however, Daniel offered a small nod of acknowledgement that seemed meant specifically for her. It wasn't the polite gesture of a man acknowledging a woman's presence out of social obligation. It was the recognition of one person by another. Simple and direct. Sarah found herself nodding back before she quite realized what she was doing. And something that might have been a smile flickered across Daniel's weathered features before he turned to follow her father toward the bunkhouse. "Well," Margaret said softly, "that should make things more interesting around here." Sarah made no reply, but she remained on the porch long after the two men had disappeared behind the barn, her embroidery forgotten in her lap as she contemplated the changes that Daniel Harrison's presence might bring to their quiet corner of Montana. The rest of that first day passed in a blur of activity, as Daniel settled into ranch life with surprising ease. Sarah caught glimpses of him through the kitchen window as she helped her mother with household tasks, leading his horses to the corral, organizing his tools in the barn, walking the property boundaries with her father to get oriented to the layout of the ranch. By evening, when the family gathered for supper, Daniel had already made himself indispensable. He had repaired a loose gate hinge that had been bothering Joseph for weeks, diagnosed and treated a minor cut on one of the horses, and identified several potential problems with the barn's foundation that would need attention before winter. Margaret had set an extra place at the kitchen table, and Sarah felt an unfamiliar nervousness as she helped carry dishes from the stove. It had been years since they had entertained anyone at their family table, and she wasn't sure how to behave around this quiet stranger who seemed to see everything and comment on very little. Daniel appeared at the kitchen door precisely at 6 o'clock, his hat in his hands and his dark hair still damp from washing at the pump behind the bunkhouse. He had changed into a clean shirt for supper, Sarah noticed, and his boots were free of the day's accumulation of dust and hay. "Smells wonderful, Mrs. Miller," he said as Margaret gestured him toward his chair. "Been a long time since I've had the pleasure of a home-cooked meal." The compliment was sincere without being effusive, and Margaret beamed with the pleasure that good cooks feel when their efforts are properly appreciated. Sarah took her usual seat across from where Daniel would sit, trying not to stare as he settled his large frame onto the sturdy wooden chair that suddenly seemed inadequate for his size. Joseph said grace with his usual brevity, and then the business of passing dishes and filling plates occupied everyone's attention for several minutes. Sarah was acutely aware of Daniel's presence across from her, the careful way he handled the serving spoons, the quiet thank you he offered each time a dish passed his way, the genuine appreciation he showed for Margaret's cooking. Sarah grew most of these vegetables herself, Margaret mentioned as Daniel sampled the green beans that had come from the garden plot beside the house. "She has quite a talent for coaxing things to grow." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected praise. Her mother meant well, but calling attention to her gardening skills felt dangerously close to advertising her few accomplishments to their guest. Daniel looked across the table with interest rather than polite indifference. "That's quite a garden you've got there. Takes real skill to get vegetables to produce this late in the season." The comment was addressed directly to her, and Sarah realized she was expected to respond. "The secret is succession planting," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you stagger when you put things in the ground, you can harvest fresh vegetables well into October." "Makes sense," Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to do something similar with her flower beds back in Ohio. Always said timing was more important than luck when it came to growing things." The simple acknowledgement of her knowledge felt like a gift. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly as the conversation moved on to other topics, the weather prospects for the remainder of the harvest season, local news from the Thompson Ranch, plans for the barn expansion that would begin the following week. Daniel proved to be an excellent dinner companion, contributing to the conversation without dominating it and showing genuine interest in the details of ranch life that many hired hands would have found boring. He asked intelligent questions about local conditions and listened carefully to the answers, clearly filing away information that would help him do his job more effectively. Most remarkably, he treated Sarah exactly as he treated her parents, with courtesy and respect, but without the careful distance that most people maintained around her. He didn't avoid looking at her when she spoke, didn't glance nervously at her walking stick propped against the wall, didn't seem to notice or care about the way she occasionally shifted in her chair to accommodate her damaged leg. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was participating in a normal conversation rather than being carefully managed around the edges of one. After supper, Daniel insisted on helping clear the table despite Margaret's protests that such work wasn't expected of him. He carried dishes with the same careful competence he brought to everything else, and Sarah noticed that he managed the task without getting in anyone's way despite his size and unfamiliarity with their kitchen. "I'll be starting work on the barn foundation first thing tomorrow," he told Joseph as they finished cleaning up. "Want to make sure everything's level and solid before we begin framing the addition." Joseph nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. No point in building on top of problems that'll just get worse over time." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, covering details about materials and work schedules, but Sarah found her attention drifting to the broader implications of Daniel's presence. For the first time since her accident, there would be someone around the ranch who didn't know her entire history, who might see her as she was now rather than as a damaged version of what she used to be. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. When Daniel finally excused himself to return to the bunkhouse, Sarah watched through the kitchen window as he crossed the darkening yard. His movements were unhurried and confident, those of a man comfortable in his surroundings, despite having been there less than a day. "He seems like a good worker," Margaret observed, joining Sarah at the window. "And respectful, too. Not all hired. Hands remember their manners at the supper table." Sarah nodded absently, still watching Daniel's retreating figure. There had been something different about the evening, a sense of normality that she hadn't experienced in years. For a few hours, she had felt like a regular young woman having dinner with her family and their guest, rather than an object of pity, carefully protected from the harsh realities of the world. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. Hope had a way of making disappointment hurt twice as much when it inevitably came. But as she helped her mother finish the evening dishes, Sarah couldn't quite bring herself to dismiss the small flame of possibility that Daniel Harrison's arrival had kindled in her chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. And for the first time in years, Sarah found herself looking forward to seeing what the day might hold. The first week of October brought an early frost that silvered the prairie grass and sent the last of the migrating birds hurrying south. Sarah woke to the sound of hammering from the direction of the barn, where Daniel had been working since dawn on the foundation repairs that would support the new addition. She dressed in her warmest wool dress and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders before making her way to the kitchen, where her mother was already preparing breakfast for the men. The routine had changed since Daniel's arrival. Meals were larger now, and Margaret took special care with the cooking, clearly pleased to have someone who appreciated her efforts. "He's been out there since before sunrise," Margaret commented, nodding toward the window where they could see Daniel's tall figure bent over his work. "Never seen anyone so dedicated to getting things done right." Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and settled at the kitchen table, positioning herself where she could watch Daniel through the glass. Over the past 2 weeks, she had found herself increasingly drawn to these quiet observations of the man who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. Daniel worked with a methodical precision that spoke of years of experience. Each movement served a purpose, whether he was measuring boards, checking angles with his carpenter's square, or driving nails with steady, powerful strokes of his hammer. There was something almost meditative about watching him work, a rhythm and flow that suggested complete absorption in his task. Joseph emerged from the bedroom, already dressed and ready for the day's labor. He had thrown himself into the barn project with an enthusiasm that surprised both Sarah and her mother, spending long hours working alongside Daniel and discussing construction details with the passion of a man revisiting a long-dormant skill. "That boy's got more carpentry knowledge in his little finger than most men have in their whole bodies," Joseph declared as he accepted his breakfast plate from Margaret. "Been teaching me tricks I never knew after 30 years of building and fixing things." The praise was high indeed, coming from a man who rarely acknowledged anyone's expertise above his own. Sarah had noticed her father's growing respect for Daniel, evidenced not just in words, but in the way he deferred to the younger man's judgment on technical matters. After breakfast, Sarah made her way outside with a basket of fresh-baked biscuits and a jar of coffee, ostensibly to provide the workers with a mid-morning meal. In truth, she had been looking for excuses to spend time near the construction site, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. Daniel was crouched beside a section of foundation stones, using a level to check their alignment. His shirt sleeves were rolled up despite the morning chill, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of physical labor. Sweat beaded on his forehead even in the cool air, testament to the intensity of his work. "Thought you might be ready for some coffee," Sarah called out as she approached, grateful that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Daniel looked up with a smile that transformed his entire face, softening the hard lines around his eyes, and revealing the gentle nature that lurked beneath his imposing exterior. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, Miss Sarah. This cold air makes a man appreciate hot coffee even more than usual." He stood and wiped his hands on a cloth before accepting the jar of coffee, careful not to let his fingers brush against hers during the exchange. Sarah noticed the consideration and felt a flutter of appreciation for his thoughtfulness. Joseph emerged from inside the barn where he had been sorting lumber, drawn by the smell of fresh biscuits and the sound of voices. "Sarah makes the best. The scouts in 3 counties," he declared with paternal pride. "Learned the recipe from her grandmother back in Illinois." The compliment brought color to Sarah's cheeks, but she was pleased to hear her father acknowledge her skills in front of Daniel. Too often, Joseph's protectiveness manifested as diminishing her accomplishments rather than celebrating them. "They smell incredible," Daniel agreed, accepting a biscuit from the basket. "Been a long time since I've had proper home baking. Most places I've worked, we made do with hardtack and whatever we could scrounge from town." As the 3 of them shared the impromptu meal, Sarah found herself relaxing into the easy camaraderie that had developed around the construction project. Daniel had a way of including her in conversations without making her feel like she was being humored or patronized. He asked genuine questions about ranch life and listened carefully to her answers, treating her observations with the same respect he showed her father's expertise. "Miss Sarah," Daniel said thoughtfully as he finished his second biscuit, "I've been wondering about something. Yesterday, when I was working on the west side of the foundation, I noticed you've got quite a herb garden planted along that wall. Those medicinal plants?" Sarah felt a familiar surge of nervous excitement. Her herb garden was one of her proudest accomplishments, a project she had undertaken after reading every book on botanical medicine she could find. But few people had ever shown interest in her knowledge of healing plants. "Some of them are," she replied carefully. "I grow chamomile for settling stomachs, willow bark for headaches, echinacea for fighting off colds. My mother taught me that a ranch wife needs to know how to doctor her family when the nearest physician is 2 days' ride away." Daniel nodded with obvious interest. "My grandmother was the same way. Had a whole collection of remedies for everything, from cuts to colic. Always said store-bought medicine was fine for town folks, but frontier families needed to be more self-sufficient." The shared understanding created an immediate bond between them. Sarah found herself opening up about her botanical studies, describing the different plants she cultivated and their various medicinal properties. Daniel listened with genuine fascination, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated he understood the complexity of what she was attempting. "Would you mind showing me the garden sometime?" he asked as they prepared to return to work. "I'd like to learn more about which plants grow best in this climate. Might come in handy to know about natural remedies when you're working far from civilization." The request sent a thrill of anticipation through Sarah's chest. Someone wanted to learn from her, to value her knowledge and expertise. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. "I'd be happy to," she replied, hoping her eagerness wasn't too obvious. "This afternoon, if you have time. The light is best for identifying different varieties around 3 o'clock. Daniel's smile was warm and genuine. "I look forward to it." As Sarah made her way back to the house, she felt lighter than she had in months. The prospect of sharing her botanical knowledge with someone who genuinely appreciated it filled her with an excitement that had nothing to do with romantic feelings and everything to do with intellectual connection. That afternoon, Sarah waited by the herb garden with barely contained enthusiasm. She had spent the morning reviewing her botanical notes and selecting specimens that would best demonstrate the principles of medicinal plant cultivation. Her walking stick felt less burdensome than usual as she moved between the carefully tended rows, checking the condition of various plants and planning her impromptu lesson. Daniel appeared precisely at 3 o'clock, having cleaned up from his construction work and changed into a fresh shirt. He carried a small notebook and pencil, clearly intending to take notes on what she taught him. "I hope you don't mind if I write some of this down," he said as he approached. "I've found that I remember things better when I can refer back to them later." The consideration touched Sarah deeply. Most people who expressed interest in her hobbies were merely being polite, with no real intention of retaining or using the information she shared. Daniel's notebook suggested he planned to take her knowledge seriously. They began with the most basic plants, chamomile, with its delicate white flowers and distinctive apple-like scent, and mint, which had spread beyond its original boundaries to colonize a significant portion of the garden's eastern edge. "The key to successful medicinal gardening," Sarah explained as they knelt beside a row of echinacea plants, "is understanding that different parts of the same plant can have different properties and potencies. With echinacea, for instance, the roots are the most powerful for boosting immunity, but the leaves and flowers can be useful too if prepared correctly." Daniel scribbled notes as she spoke, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting that she repeat particularly important details. His questions were thoughtful and demonstrated that he was genuinely processing the information, rather than simply going through the motions of polite interest. "This purple coneflower here," Sarah continued, touching a particularly robust specimen, "needs to be harvested at just the right time if you want maximum potency. Too early and the active compounds haven't fully developed. Too late and they start to break down." As they moved through the garden, Sarah found herself sharing not just practical information, but also the stories behind her knowledge, how she had learned to identify plants from books and experimentation, which remedies had proven most effective for common ailments, and how she had adapted traditional recipes to work with locally available ingredients. Daniel proved to be an excellent student, asking perceptive questions and making connections between different pieces of information. When Sarah mentioned that willow bark could be chewed for headache relief, he immediately asked whether the same principle applied to other types of pain, demonstrating the kind of analytical thinking that made teaching a pleasure rather than a chore. "You really know your subject," he observed as they examined a particularly impressive stand of mullein plants. "How long have you been studying botanical medicine?" "About 4 years seriously," Sarah replied, then hesitated before adding, "I started after my accident. Had a lot of time to read while I was recovering, and I became fascinated by how much healing knowledge people used to take for granted." It was the first time she had directly referenced her injury in Daniel's presence, and she held her breath waiting for his reaction. Most people became uncomfortable when she mentioned her disability, either rushing to change the subject or overwhelming her with awkward sympathy. Daniel simply nodded and continued examining the mullein leaves. "Makes sense that you'd want to understand healing," he said matter-of-factly. "Must have been frustrating to be laid up for so long, especially someone as active as you clearly are." The response was perfect, acknowledging her experience without making it the focus of the conversation or treating her as an object of pity. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for his natural tact and genuine acceptance of her circumstances. They spent nearly 2 hours in the garden, with Sarah demonstrating proper harvesting techniques and explaining the processes for drying and preparing various remedies. Daniel filled several pages of his notebook with sketches and detailed notes, clearly determined to master the information she was sharing. As the afternoon light began to fade, they found themselves sitting on a wooden bench that Joseph had built along the garden's southern edge. Sarah's damaged leg was beginning to ache from the extended period of standing and walking, but she was reluctant to what had been one of the most intellectually satisfying conversations of her adult life. "I can't thank you enough for sharing all this knowledge," Daniel said as he reviewed his notes. "I feel like I've learned more about practical medicine in one afternoon than I picked up in years of traveling around." Sarah glowed under the praise, but something in Daniel's tone suggested he had more to say. She waited quietly, giving him space to gather his thoughts. "Miss Sarah," he continued carefully, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but it seems to me that you've got a real gift for teaching. The way you explain things, breaking complex ideas down into understandable pieces, making connections between different concepts, that's a rare talent." The observation hit Sarah like a physical blow, so unexpected and accurate that it took her breath away. She had always enjoyed sharing knowledge with others, but no one had ever identified teaching as one of her natural abilities. She began, then stopped, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected compliment. "I'm serious." Daniel pressed gently. "You made learning about medicinal plants interesting and accessible. That's not something everyone can do, even when they know their subject matter inside and out." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the validation of abilities she had never considered valuable in the context of frontier life. Teaching required physical stamina that she lacked, or so she had always assumed. But Daniel's observation suggested that intellectual gifts might be just as important as physical capabilities. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower toward the horizon, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. For the first time since her accident, someone had seen past her physical limitations to recognize abilities she possessed rather than mourning those she had lost. When Daniel finally rose to return to his evening chores, he paused beside the bench where Sarah remained seated. "Would you be willing to teach me more about this?" he asked. "I mean, on a regular basis? I'd be happy to help with the garden work in exchange for the lessons." The offer was more generous than he knew. Sarah's herb garden required constant attention, weeding, watering, harvesting, and processing, much of which was difficult for her to manage alone with her physical limitations. "I'd like that very much," she replied, her heart racing with anticipation. "We could meet every afternoon when you finish your construction work." Daniel's smile was warm and genuine. "It's a deal then. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time." As he walked away toward the bunkhouse, Sarah remained on the garden bench, watching the last of the daylight fade across the prairie. Something had changed today, something important and potentially life-altering. For the first time in years, she had been valued for her mind rather than pitied for her body. The realization filled her with a hope, so intense it was almost frightening. But as she finally rose and made her way slowly back to the house, Sarah allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to have a future built on intellectual partnership rather than physical accommodation. The walking stick felt lighter in her hand as she climbed the porch steps, and for the first time since her accident, Sarah Miller began to believe that she might have something valuable to offer the right person. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing the first real blizzard of the season 3 weeks earlier than anyone had expected. Sarah woke to a world-transformed snow piled against the windows, wind howling around the corners of the house, and the familiar landscape buried beneath a blanket of white that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The storm had begun during the night and showed no signs of abating. From her bedroom window, Sarah could barely make out the barn through the swirling snow, its dark bulk looming like a ghost ship in the white wilderness that had replaced their familiar ranch yard. She found her parents huddled around the kitchen stove, their faces etched with the worry that all ranch families felt when winter struck with such sudden fury. Joseph was already dressed in his heaviest coat and boots, preparing to venture out to check on the animals despite the dangerous conditions. "Stock's gotta be fed and watered," he muttered, winding a thick scarf around his neck. "Storm-like. This can kill cattle faster than wolves if they don't have proper shelter." Margaret's face was pale with concern. "Joseph, you can't go out in this. The visibility is near zero, and the temperature's dropping by the hour. You'll get lost before You make it halfway to the barn." But Joseph was already heading for the door, his jaw set with the stubborn determination that had carried him through 25 years of frontier challenges. Sarah knew that nothing would stop him from checking on the animals that represented their family's livelihood and future security. "I'll be fine," he called back, though his voice betrayed none of the confidence his words suggested. "Daniel's probably already out there seeing the horses. Between the two of us, we can get everything secured." The mention of Daniel sent a spike of anxiety through Sarah's chest. She had grown accustomed to their daily meetings in the herb garden, conversations that had evolved from simple botanical lessons into wide-ranging discussions about everything from literature to philosophy. The thought of him struggling alone through the blizzard filled her with a fear that surprised her. With its intensity, the morning stretched endlessly as Sarah and her mother waited for news from the men. They kept busy with household tasks, baking bread, mending clothes, organizing the pantry, but their attention remained fixed on the windows, hoping for any sign of movement through the swirling snow. By noon, neither Joseph nor Daniel had returned to the house, and Margaret's worry had escalated to barely controlled panic. "They should have been back by now," she said for the dozenth time, pacing between the kitchen window and the front door. Even in this weather, feeding and watering shouldn't take more than a few hours. Sarah shared her mother's concern, but she also understood the reality of ranch work during severe weather. Animals required constant attention during blizzards, checking for frostbite, breaking ice on water troughs, ensuring adequate shelter and feed. The work was exhausting under normal conditions and could become life-threatening when visibility dropped to mere feet. The sound of someone pounding on the front door sent both women rushing toward the entrance. Sarah's heart leaped with relief, expecting to see her father and Daniel stamping snow from their boots and complaining about the bitter cold. Instead, she found Daniel alone, his face grim beneath a coating of ice that had formed on his eyebrows and mustache. His clothes were soaked through despite his heavy coat, and his hands shook as he pulled off his gloves. "Where's Joseph?" Margaret demanded before Daniel could speak. "He's trapped in the south pasture," Daniel replied, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. One of the fence posts gave way under the snow load, and several head of cattle broke through into the gully beyond the creek. He went after them, but the storm's gotten worse since then. "I lost sight of him about an hour ago." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. The south pasture was nearly a mile from the main ranch buildings, and the gully he mentioned was known for its treacherous footing, even in good weather. In blizzard conditions, it would be a death trap for man or beast. "I've got to go back out there," Daniel continued, already reaching for his gloves. "But I need rope and blankets, and someone needs to keep a light burning in the kitchen window so we can find our way back." Margaret was already moving toward the supply closet, her hands steady despite the terror in her eyes. "Take whatever you need. There's rope in the barn, and I'll get blankets from the linen chest." Sarah watched the preparations with growing frustration. Her father was in mortal danger, and she was trapped in the house by her physical limitations, unable to contribute anything meaningful to his rescue. The walking stick that leaned against the kitchen wall seemed to mock her helplessness. "I'm coming with you," she announced suddenly, the words surprising her as much as they did Daniel and her mother. Both of them turned to stare at her in shock. Margaret recovered first, her voice sharp with alarm. "Sarah, no, absolutely not. You can't possibly manage in this weather." "Your mother's right," Daniel added gently but firmly. "This is no place for—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but Sarah knew what he had been about to say. No place for a cripple. The familiar sting of being dismissed and protected flared into anger that gave Sarah strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I know this ranch better than anyone," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her chest. "I know every gully, every fence line, every shelter where cattle might take refuge. You've been here less than 2 months, Daniel. In weather like this, you need someone who knows the land. Daniel's expression was conflicted, clearly torn between practical necessity and concern for her safety. Miss Sarah, I appreciate the offer, but the snow is already knee-deep and getting worse. The walking would be difficult, Sarah finished for him. Yes, I know. Everything is difficult for me. But my father is out there, possibly dying, and I'm not going to sit in this kitchen doing nothing while you stumble around in a blizzard looking for him. The argument that followed was brief but intense. Margaret pleaded with her daughter to reconsider, pointing out the obvious dangers and physical challenges. Daniel tried to find diplomatic ways to exclude her from the rescue effort without directly referencing her disability. But Sarah had made up her mind, and nothing they said could shake her determination. For too long, she had accepted the role of helpless invalid, allowing others to make decisions about what she could and couldn't do. Today, with her father's life hanging in balance, she refused to be sidelined by her own limitations. I'm going, she declared with finality. You can either help me get ready, or you can waste time arguing while Papa freezes to death in that gully. Faced with her implacable resolve, Daniel and Margaret capitulated. Margaret hurried to find her daughter's warmest clothes, while Daniel went to the barn to gather rope and additional supplies. Sarah used the time to prepare herself mentally for what would undoubtedly be the most physically demanding challenge she had faced since her accident. 20 minutes later, she stood on the front porch dressed in her father's heaviest coat and boots, with wool scarves wrapped around her face and neck. The walking stick had been replaced by a longer staff that Daniel had fashioned from a piece of oak lumber, better suited for navigating deep snow and rough terrain. The wind hit them like a living thing as soon as they stepped off the porch, driving snow into their faces with stinging force. The familiar ranch yard had been transformed into an alien landscape of drifts and shadows, with landmarks obscured or completely buried beneath the accumulating snow. Daniel had tied a rope around his waist and extended the other end to Sarah, creating a lifeline that would prevent them from becoming separated in the whiteout conditions. She appreciated the precaution while simultaneously resenting the reminder of her vulnerability. The journey to the south pasture became an epic of endurance almost immediately. The snow was indeed knee-deep in many places and deeper where it had drifted against fence lines and buildings. Sarah's damaged leg screamed in protest with every step, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace. Determined not to slow their progress, Daniel stayed close beside her, ready to offer assistance, but careful not to hover or assume she needed help unless she asked for it. His sensitivity to her pride meant everything to Sarah, even as she struggled with the physical demands of their mission. The familiar landscape had become a maze of white, with fence posts barely visible above the snow and familiar landmarks completely obscured. Sarah found herself relying on instincts developed over 23 years of living on this land, sensing the subtle changes in terrain that indicated their location relative to the missing cattle and her father. The gully should be just ahead, she called out, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Papa would have followed the fence line until it drops down toward the creek. They pressed forward through snow that seemed to grow deeper with every step. Sarah's legs were trembling with exhaustion, and her lungs burned from breathing the frigid air, but she refused to admit weakness or ask for rest. Somewhere ahead, her father needed their help, and nothing would stop her from reaching him. The fence post that had collapsed under the snow load appeared suddenly through the swirling white, its broken remains jutting from a drift like the bones of some massive creature. Beyond it, the ground fell away sharply toward the creek bottom where Joseph had presumably gone in pursuit of the lost cattle. Daniel cupped his hands around his mouth and bellowed Joseph's name into the wind. They waited, listening intently for any response, but heard only the endless moan of the storm and the crack of ice-laden tree branches in the distance. "We need to go down into the gully," Sarah said, though the prospect filled her with dread. The slope was treacherous, even in good weather, and with snow covering the rocks and fallen logs that made footing uncertain, it would be like descending into a frozen hell. Daniel looked at the steep incline with obvious concern. "Miss Sarah, I don't think. My father is down there," she cut him off. "And if we don't find him soon, he's going to die of exposure. I'm going down that slope whether you help me or not." The descent was a nightmare of slipping, sliding, and barely controlled falls. Sarah's walking staff proved invaluable, providing stability and support as she navigated the treacherous terrain. Daniel stayed close, ready to catch her if she fell, but he allowed her to make her own way at her own pace. Halfway down the slope, they heard it, a faint call for help, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably human. Sarah's heart leaped with hope and fear as they changed direction toward the sound, fighting their way through snow-laden brush and around ice-covered boulders. They found Joseph huddled beneath an overhanging ledge, his face blue with cold and his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. 3 head of cattle stood nearby, their bulk providing some protection from the wind, but their presence also indicating the hopelessness of the situation. Without help, neither man nor beast would survive the night in these conditions. "About time you got here," Joseph managed through chattering teeth, trying to maintain his usual gruff demeanor despite his obvious distress. "Thought I was going to have to walk home on this busted leg." Sarah knelt beside her father, her botanical training taking over as she assessed his condition. Hypothermia was the immediate danger, but the leg injury would complicate any rescue attempt. They needed to get him warm and mobile quickly, or risk losing him to the cold that was already sapping his strength. "Daniel, we need to get a fire started," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "There's deadwood under that overhang, and I have matches in my coat pocket." As Daniel worked to gather fuel for a fire, Sarah began the process of examining her father's injured leg and determining the best way to get him back to the house. The knowledge she had gained from her botanical studies included basic understanding of human anatomy and injury treatment, skills that had always seemed academic until this moment. The storm raged around them as they worked to save Joseph Miller's life, but Sarah no longer felt like a helpless invalid watching from the sidelines. For the first time since her accident, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. The blizzard had become her test, and she was determined not to fail it. The small fire Daniel managed to coax from the damp wood cast dancing shadows against the rock overhang, providing precious warmth but little comfort against the howling fury of the blizzard. Sarah knelt beside her father, her hands working with surprising steadiness as she examined his injured leg through the torn fabric of his pants. "Feels like the bones cracked clean through," Joseph muttered, his teeth chattering so violently he could barely speak. "Happened when I was chasing those fool cattle down the slope. Stepped in a hole hidden by the snow." Sarah's fingers probed gently along his shin, feeling for the telltale irregularities that would indicate a fracture. Her botanical studies had included basic anatomy, and she had read every medical text that passed through their isolated community. The knowledge felt inadequate now, faced with her father's obvious pain and the life-threatening cold that threatened them all. "It's definitely broken," she confirmed, her voice calmer than she felt. "But it's a clean break, not compound. We can splint it with branches and get you mobile enough to make it back to the house." Daniel looked up from feeding twigs to their meager fire, his face grim in the flickering light. "Miss Sarah, I don't think you understand how serious this is. The snow's getting deeper by the hour, and the temperature's dropping fast. Even if we get your father stabilized, I'm not sure we can make it back up that slope in these conditions." The brutal honesty in his voice sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the frigid air. She had been so focused on reaching her father that she hadn't fully considered the challenges of getting him back to safety. The descent into the gully had been treacherous enough with all of them mobile. Carrying or supporting an injured man up that icy slope in blizzard conditions might prove impossible. Then we'll have to wait it out here, she said, with more confidence than she felt. The storm can't last forever, and this overhang provides decent shelter. We just need to keep warm and conserve our strength. Joseph's laugh was harsh and bitter. Listen to yourself, girl. This ain't some camping trip. We've got maybe 6 hours before hypothermia starts shutting down our bodies for good. And that's if we can keep this fire going, which ain't likely with the wind and wet wood. The stark assessment of their situation settled over them like another layer of snow. Sarah could see the fear in Daniel's eyes, carefully controlled, but unmistakably present. Her father's condition was deteriorating rapidly, his face taking on the waxy pallor that indicated advancing cold injury. But instead of despair, Sarah felt something else rising in her chest, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent 5 years being told what she couldn't do, what was beyond her capabilities, what limitations defined her existence. Tonight, in this frozen hell, she refused to accept defeat. "Daniel, help me gather more wood," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Anything that will burn dead branches, bark, even green wood if that's all we can find. We're going to build a fire that will last until morning." As Daniel ventured back into the storm to collect fuel, Sarah turned her attention to her father's immediate needs. Using strips torn from her own petticoat, she began fashioning a makeshift splint from 2 straight branches Daniel had left beside the fire. "Hold still, Papa," she murmured as she positioned the wood along his injured leg. "This is going to hurt, but we need to stabilize the break before you go into shock." Joseph gritted his teeth as she secured the splint with methodical precision, her movements sure despite the cold that made her fingers clumsy. The pain brought tears to his eyes, but he made no sound of complaint, recognizing that his daughter was fighting for his life with skills he had never known she possessed. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked through clenched teeth as she finished securing the bandages. "Mrs. Henderson lent me her husband's medical books," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "Figured it was knowledge worth having, even if I never expected to use it like this." The admission revealed yet another dimension of his daughter's capabilities that Joseph had never fully appreciated. While he had been focused on her physical limitations, she had been quietly acquiring knowledge and skills that were proving invaluable in their current crisis. Daniel returned with an armload of wood, most of it green and likely to produce more smoke than heat, but fuel nonetheless. His coat was crusted with ice, and his movements had taken on the careful deliberation of someone fighting off the early stages of hypothermia. "Found some pine bark that might catch easier," he reported, dumping his collection near the fire. "But the wind's getting worse, and visibility's down to maybe 3 feet. We're not going anywhere until the storm breaks." Sarah nodded grimly, already working to arrange the new fuel in a way that would maximize their heat output while conserving their limited supply. The fire had become their lifeline, the difference between survival and becoming frozen corpses. Found by spring thaw. As the night deepened around them, their small shelter became a tiny island of warmth and light in an endless sea of howling darkness. The 3 of them huddled close together, sharing body heat and taking turns feeding the fire that represented their only hope of seeing another dawn. Sarah found herself taking charge of their survival efforts with a natural authority that surprised everyone, including herself. She rationed their meager food supplies, assigned shifts for fire duty, and monitored both men for signs of advancing hypothermia. The leadership role felt strange but oddly comfortable, as if she had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. "Tell me about Ohio," she said to Daniel during one of their dark vigils, recognizing the need to keep him talking and alert. "What was it like growing up there?" Daniel's voice was thick with exhaustion and cold, but he managed to smile at the question. "Green," he said simply. Everything was green and growing. My father had a workshop behind our house where he taught me woodworking. Smelled like sawdust and linseed oil year-round. As he spoke, Sarah could picture the scene he described, a young Daniel learning his trade in a warm, well-lit shop, surrounded by the tools and materials of his father's craft. The image seemed impossibly distant from their current reality, of ice and darkness and the constant struggle to stay alive. "What made you come west?" she pressed, partly from genuine curiosity and partly from the need to keep him engaged and conscious. "Adventure, I suppose. And the chance to build something of my own." Daniel's laugh was rueful. "Seemed romantic at the time, riding off into the sunset, to make my fortune on the frontier. Reality's been somewhat different than I imagined." Joseph stirred beside the fire, his face drawn with pain but his eyes alert. "Reality's always different than what young folks imagine," he observed. "Question is whether you've got the sand to stick with it when things get hard." The comment was directed at Daniel, but Sarah felt it applied to her as well. Tonight had stripped away all pretense and revealed the essential truth of who they were when everything else was taken away. She had always wondered if she had the strength to face real adversity, and now she was finding out. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The storm showed no signs of abating, and their wood supply dwindled despite Sarah's careful rationing. The cold was a living thing that pressed against their small circle of warmth, looking for any opportunity to claim them. Around midnight, Joseph's condition took a turn for the worse. The combination of his injury, blood loss, and exposure began to overwhelm his body's ability to maintain core temperature. His speech became slurred, and his responses grew sluggish. Classic signs of severe hypothermia. "We need to get him warmer," Sarah said urgently, stripping off her outer coat to wrap around her father's shivering form. "Daniel, give me your coat too. We need to share body heat directly." The next hour became a desperate battle against death itself. Sarah and Daniel pressed close to Joseph on either side, using their own body heat to warm his failing system while maintaining the fire that provided their only external heat source. It was exhausting work that left all of them drained, but gradually Joseph's condition stabilized. "You saved my life, girl," he whispered during a lucid moment, his eyes focusing on Sarah's face with an expression she had never seen before. "Always knew you were smart, but I never realized how strong you really are." The words hit Sarah harder than any physical blow. For 5 years, she had craved exactly this kind of recognition from her father, acknowledgement that she was more than her physical limitations, that she had value beyond what her damaged body could accomplish. "I learned from watching you, Papa," she replied softly. "You never gave up on anything, no matter how hard it got. I figured if I was your daughter, I'd better have some of that same stubborn streak." Joseph's smile was weak but genuine. "Stubborn's one word for it. Your mother always said it was more like pig-headed determination." As dawn approached, the storm finally began to show signs of weakening. The wind's constant howl dropped to intermittent gusts, and the driving snow thinned enough to allow glimpses of the gray sky above their shelter. Daniel ventured out to assess their situation and returned with cautiously optimistic news. "Storms breaking up, and I can see the outline of the main house from here. Snow's still deep, but it's stopped accumulating. If we can fashion some kind of stretcher for your father, I think we can make it back." The construction of a makeshift stretcher from branches and rope became their next challenge. Sarah's knowledge of knots and her careful attention to weight distribution proved crucial in creating something sturdy enough to transport Joseph up the treacherous slope. The journey back to the house took nearly 3 hours of exhausting work. Sarah and Daniel took turns pulling and supporting the stretcher, fighting through snow that reached their thighs in places and navigating obstacles that would have been challenging even in good conditions. But they made it. As the familiar outline of their home emerged from the white landscape, Sarah felt a surge of triumph that had nothing to do with reaching safety and everything to do with proving to herself and everyone else that she was capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. Margaret met them at the door, tears streaming down her face as she helped them carry Joseph inside to the warmth and safety of their kitchen. The reunion was emotional and chaotic, with everyone talking at once and trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Later, after Joseph had been settled in his bed with his leg properly splinted and hot food warming all of them, from the inside out, Sarah found herself alone with Daniel in the kitchen. The ordinary domestic scene felt surreal after their night of survival in the wilderness. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said quietly, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that he seemed reluctant to release. "When you insisted on coming with me, I thought. Well, I thought you'd be more hindrance than help." Sarah nodded, unsurprised by the admission. "Most people think that about me. I'm used to it." "But I was wrong," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "You saved your father's life last night. Hell, you probably saved all our lives. I couldn't have managed alone out there." The acknowledgement was everything Sarah had ever wanted to hear, validation that she was capable and valuable and strong. But more than that, it was recognition from someone whose opinion had come to matter more to her than she had previously realized. "We saved each other," she said simply. "That's what people do when they care about each other." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But something fundamental had changed. During their long night in the storm, something that would reshape all their relationships going forward. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in 2 days, casting brilliant light across the snow-covered landscape. The world looked clean and new, washed pure by the storm that had tested them all and found them worthy of survival. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the light play across the drifts that had nearly claimed their lives, and realized that she was seeing everything, including herself, with completely different eyes. The weeks following the blizzard brought an unexpected transformation to the Miller household. Joseph's recovery from his broken leg created a new dynamic where Sarah's medical knowledge became indispensable to daily life on the ranch. She monitored his healing progress, adjusted his splint as the swelling subsided, and prepared herbal remedies to manage his pain and prevent infection. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah found herself essential rather than peripheral to the family's well-being. The confidence she had discovered during that terrible night in the storm began to blossom into something larger, a fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. Daniel had thrown himself into completing the barn expansion with renewed vigor, as if physical labor could help him process the emotional upheaval of recent events. But Sarah noticed the way his eyes sought her out during meals, the careful attention he paid to her observations about ranch management, and the subtle deference he now showed to her judgment on matters he once would have dismissed. December brought lighter snowfalls and clearer skies, along with an unexpected visitor. Sarah was tending to her father's afternoon bandage change when Margaret called from the front window, her voice tight with surprise. "Sarah, honey, you'd better come see this." At the kitchen window, Sarah peered through the frost-etched glass to see a familiar figure riding up their lane. James Hartwell sat his horse with the same confident bearing she remembered from his previous visit, but something was different about his manner, less casual, more purposeful. "Wonder what brings him back," Margaret murmured. "Thought we'd seen the last of the Hartwell boys after your father sent them packing." Sarah's stomach tightened with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The confident young woman who had emerged from the blizzard ordeal warred with the old Sarah who had grown accustomed to rejection and dismissal. Part of her wanted to retreat to her room and avoid whatever conversation was about to unfold. But another part, the part that had taken charge during a life-threatening crisis, stood straighter and smoothed her skirts with deliberate calm. Whatever James Hartwell had come to say, She would face it directly rather than hiding behind her father's protective barriers. Joseph had insisted on coming downstairs despite his injury, settling into his favorite chair by the fireplace with his splinted leg elevated on a wooden stool. The forced inactivity chafed at him, but he had grudgingly accepted the limitations imposed by his healing bones. Daniel emerged from the barn as James dismounted, wiping his hands on a cloth and regarding the visitor with polite wariness. The two men had never been formally introduced, but Daniel's protective instincts toward the Miller family had grown pronounced since the blizzard, and he clearly viewed any unexpected visitor as potentially problematic. "Afternoon, Mr. Miller," James called as he approached the house, his hat respectfully removed. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I heard about your accident and wanted to pay my respects." Joseph's expression was carefully neutral as he gestured for James to enter. News travels fast in these parts. "Come in out of the cold." Sarah positioned herself near the kitchen doorway where she could observe the conversation without being the center of attention. She had learned the value of watching and listening before revealing her own thoughts, a skill that had served her well during recent challenges. James settled into the chair Margaret offered, his manner more subdued than Sarah remembered from his previous visits. He inquired politely about Joseph's recovery, complimented Margaret on her coffee, and made appropriate comments about the severity of the early winter weather. But Sarah could sense an underlying tension in his demeanor, a nervous energy that suggested this social call had a deeper purpose. When the preliminary courtesies had been exhausted, James cleared his throat and addressed Joseph directly. "Sir, I hope you'll forgive my boldness, but I've come here today with a specific intention. Recent events have given me cause to reconsider certain matters, and I find myself compelled to speak plainly about something that's been weighing on my mind." Joseph's eyebrows rose slightly at this formal declaration. "Speak your piece, then. I've never been one for beating around the bush." James glanced toward Sarah, his expression earnest rather than dismissive. "I've heard what happened during the blizzard. How Miss Sarah ventured out into that storm to help rescue you, and how her knowledge and courage likely saved your life." The unexpected direction of the conversation caught everyone off guard. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncomfortable with being the subject of discussion, but also curious about where this was leading. "Stories gotten a bit exaggerated in the telling, I suspect," Joseph replied carefully. "But Sarah did show considerable fortitude that night." "More than fortitude from what I hear," James pressed. "Doc Henderson mentioned that she treated your injuries with skill that would credit a trained physician. Said she displayed medical knowledge that most frontier women never acquire." Sarah could see her father struggling with conflicting impulses, pride in his daughter's accomplishments warring with his ingrained protectiveness. The conversation was venturing into territory he had always tried to avoid, forcing him to acknowledge capabilities he had spent years downplaying. "Sarah's always been intelligent," Margaret interjected softly. "She reads everything she can get her hands on and has a particular interest in botanical medicine." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's precisely what I've come to discuss. You see, my family has been corresponding with relatives back east about establishing a proper school in our territory. We've secured funding and identified a suitable building, but we've struggled to find qualified teachers willing to relocate to such an isolated region." The implication of his words began to dawn on Sarah even before he stated his purpose explicitly. Her heart started beating faster as she contemplated possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "We need someone with education, patience, and the kind of practical intelligence that can adapt book learning to frontier conditions," James continued. "Someone who understands this community and commands respect from both children and adults." Joseph's expression had grown wary as he began to grasp the direction of the conversation. "What exactly are you proposing, Hartwell?" "I'm proposing that Miss Sarah consider accepting the position of head teacher for our new school," James replied directly. The salary would be $40 a month plus housing and rooms above the schoolhouse. She would have complete authority over curriculum and teaching methods, with full support from the school board. The silence that followed was profound and charged with emotion. Sarah felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet, opening up vistas of possibility she had never allowed herself to contemplate. Teaching had always seemed beyond her reach, requiring physical stamina and social acceptance that her circumstances made impossible. "That's generous of you," Joseph said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. "But I'm not sure Sarah would be suited for such demanding work. Teaching requires intelligence, patience, creativity, and genuine concern for others' welfare," James interrupted firmly. "All qualities Miss Sarah has demonstrated repeatedly. As for physical demands, we would ensure the position accommodated any special requirements." Sarah found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate the offer, but surely there are more qualified candidates. Women with formal training and teaching experience." James turned to face her directly, his expression earnest and respectful. "Miss Sarah, I've spent considerable time investigating this matter. Formal training is valuable, but it can't substitute for natural ability and genuine dedication. Everyone I've spoken with agrees that you possess both in abundance." The conversation continued for another hour, with James outlining the details of the position and addressing the practical concerns that Joseph and Margaret raised. The school would serve children from 6 to 16, with enrollment expected to reach 25 pupils by the following autumn. Sarah would be responsible for all subjects from basic literacy to advanced mathematics and natural sciences. Most remarkably, James made it clear that Sarah's physical limitations were not considered impediments to her effectiveness as a teacher. The schoolhouse had been designed with accessibility in mind, and the community was prepared to provide whatever accommodations might be necessary. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said finally, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the opportunity being presented. "This is not a decision I can make lightly." "Of course," James agreed readily. "Take all the time you need. The position won't be filled until spring, so there's no immediate pressure." After James departed, the Miller family sat in stunned silence, each processing the implications of what had just occurred. The offer represented everything Sarah had secretly dreamed of but never believed possible: meaningful work, financial independence, and recognition of her intellectual capabilities. But it also meant leaving the only home she had ever known, striking out on her own in a way that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. "It's a good opportunity," Margaret said carefully, breaking the silence. "Teaching is respectable work for a woman, and the salary is generous." Joseph's response was more complex, reflecting his struggle between protective instincts and growing recognition of his daughter's capabilities. "It's a big step," he said slowly. "Living alone, managing a classroom full of children, dealing with parents and school board members. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" Before Sarah could respond, Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face flushed from cold and his manner urgent. "Excuse me for interrupting, but I couldn't help overhearing part of that conversation. Did James Hartwell just offer Miss Sarah a teaching position?" "He did," Joseph confirmed, studying Daniel's expression with interest. "What's your opinion on the matter?" Daniel's response was immediate and emphatic. "I think it's exactly what she should be doing. Miss Sarah has a gift for explaining complex ideas in ways people can understand. She's patient, knowledgeable, and genuinely cares about helping others learn. Any community would be lucky to have her as their teacher." The endorsement from Daniel carried particular weight because it came from someone who had witnessed Sarah's capabilities under extreme conditions. His opinion mattered to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. But what about the ranch? Sarah asked, voicing one of her deepest concerns. With Papa's leg injury, you'll need all the help you can get. How can I abandon the family when you need me most? Joseph's expression softened at the question, revealing the depth of affection beneath his gruff exterior. Sarah girl, the ranch will survive just fine. Your mother and I managed it for 20 years before you were old enough to help, and we'll manage it again. Besides, Daniel's proven himself more capable than any 3 hired hands I've ever employed. The praise for Daniel was genuine but also served to address Sarah's practical concerns about leaving her family without adequate support. Joseph had clearly been thinking about the logistics of her potential departure, and had concluded that the ranch would indeed survive her absence. There's something else to consider, Margaret added quietly. If you take this position, you'll be showing other young women in the territory that there are possibilities beyond marriage and motherhood. You'll be proving that intelligence and determination can overcome almost any obstacle. The observation struck Sarah with unexpected force. She had been so focused on her own circumstances that she hadn't considered the broader implications of accepting the teaching position. Her success could indeed inspire other women who felt trapped by societal expectations or physical limitations. Over the following days, the teaching offer dominated conversation around the Miller dinner table. Daniel proved to be one of Sarah's strongest advocates, sharing stories from his travels about teachers he had encountered who had transformed entire communities through their dedication and skill. There was a woman in Kansas, he told them one evening, who started teaching in a one-room schoolhouse with 8 students and a handful of worn textbooks. By the time I passed through 5 years later, she had over 40 pupils, a proper school building, and had convinced the territorial government to establish a library. One person can make that kind of difference if they have the vision and determination to see it through. Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to the possibility of making such an impact. The prospect of nurturing young minds, of helping children develop their potential regardless of their circumstances or backgrounds, appealed to something deep in her nature, but accepting the position would mean leaving Daniel, and that consideration carried emotional weight she was reluctant to examine too closely. Over the weeks since the blizzard, their relationship had evolved into something that felt both precious and fragile, a connection that might not survive the test of separation. The decision came to a head during one of their afternoon sessions. In the herb garden, now dormant under its blanket of snow, but still the place where Sarah felt most comfortable discussing important matters with Daniel. I keep thinking about that teaching offer, she admitted as they sat on the wooden bench that Joseph had built along the garden's edge. It's everything I've ever wanted, but ... But? Daniel prompted gently when she trailed off. But it would mean leaving here, leaving my family, leaving. She hesitated, unsure how to articulate feelings she barely understood herself. Leaving me, Daniel finished for her, his voice soft but certain. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at having her unspoken thoughts voiced so directly. I didn't mean to presume. You're not presuming anything, Daniel interrupted. I've been thinking the same thing. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength and intelligence and courage, it's changed everything for me. The admission hung between them in the crisp winter air, loaded with implications that neither had dared to voice before. Sarah felt her heart racing as she contemplated the possibility that her feelings might be reciprocated. Sarah, Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength, I need you to know that whatever you decide about that teaching position, it should be based on what's best for you, not on what you think others might want or need. The statement was both generous and heartbreaking, offering her complete freedom while simultaneously revealing the depth of his feelings. Sarah had never experienced such selfless support from anyone outside her immediate family. What if I told you that what's best for me might include having you in my life? She asked quietly, surprised by her own boldness. Daniel's smile was radiant and transformative. Then I'd say that we should find a way to make that happen. If you want to teach, then I'll find work near whatever school will have you. If you want to stay here, then I'll count myself the luckiest man in Montana Territory." The conversation that followed explored possibilities neither had dared to imagine just weeks earlier. They talked about dreams and fears, about the challenges of building a life together despite the obstacles society would place in their path, and about the profound connection that had developed between them through shared trials and mutual respect. As the sun set over the snow-covered prairie, Sarah felt a sense of clarity that had been missing from her life for years. The teaching position remained attractive, but it no longer represented her only path to fulfillment and independence. With Daniel's support and partnership, other possibilities emerged, ways to contribute to their community while building something meaningful together. "I have an idea," she said suddenly, inspired by a vision that seemed to synthesize all her hopes and concerns. "What if we could bring education here, to our own community? Start a school that serves the scattered ranches and settlements in this area?" Daniel's eyes lit up with understanding and enthusiasm. "You could teach, and I could build whatever facilities you needed. We could create something that serves families who can't send their children away for proper schooling." The idea gained momentum as they discussed it, each adding details and possibilities that made the vision seem not only feasible but necessary. The territory was growing rapidly, with new families arriving each season who needed educational opportunities for their children. By the time they returned to the house for supper, Sarah had made her decision. She would decline James Hartwell's generous offer in favor of something even more ambitious, creating their own school that would serve their community while allowing her to remain close to family and the man she was beginning to love. The announcement at dinner was met with surprise, delight, and immediate offers of support from both her parents. Joseph, in particular, seemed relieved that his daughter had found a way to pursue her dreams without leaving the safety and familiarity of home. "We could use the south section near the creek," he offered immediately. "Good water source level, ground for building, and close enough to the main road that families could reach it easily." Margaret began planning immediately as well, suggesting ways to spread word about the school and identifying families who might be interested in enrolling their children. As the evening progressed and plans took shape around the kitchen table, Sarah felt a deep sense of rightness about the path she had chosen. She would indeed become a teacher, but on her own terms and in partnership with people who valued and supported her completely. The girl who had once been dismissed as unmarriageable had become a woman with purpose, prospects, and the promise of a love that saw her strength rather than her limitations. The transformation was complete, but the real adventure was just beginning. Spring arrived early that year, melting the last of winter's snow and revealing a landscape transformed, not just by the changing seasons but by the dreams and plans that had taken root during the long months of cold and contemplation. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching Daniel and her father survey the site they had chosen for the new schoolhouse. Their animated gestures and frequent pointing, suggesting the kind of detailed planning that turns vision into reality. Months since her decision to create their own school had been a whirlwind of activity. Word had spread quickly throughout the territory about the educational opportunity being developed on the Miller Ranch, and families from as far as 50 miles away had expressed interest in enrolling their children. What had begun as a modest idea to serve their immediate community had evolved into something far more ambitious and significant. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind her, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman watching her carefully laid plans come to fruition. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday while you were in town with Daniel," she said, settling into the chair beside Sarah's bed. "She wanted to know if we'd consider adding boarding facilities for children whose families live too far away for daily travel." The suggestion wasn't entirely unexpected. Several families had inquired about such arrangements, recognizing that quality education was worth considerable sacrifice and expense. But it would require expanding their vision yet again, transforming a simple schoolhouse into something resembling a small educational institution. "What did you tell her?" Sarah asked, though she could guess from her mother's expression that the idea had been well received. "I told her we'd discuss it as a family," Margaret replied diplomatically. "But I also mentioned that the old bunkhouse behind the barn could be converted into dormitory space with relatively little work." Sarah smiled at her mother's characteristic blend of caution and enthusiasm. Margaret had become one of the school project's most dedicated supporters, throwing herself into the planning with the same energy she had once devoted exclusively to household management. The sound of approaching horses drew both women to the window, where they could see a small procession making its way up the lane toward the house. Sarah recognized several of the riders' members of families who had committed to sending their children to the new school, but others were strangers. "Looks like word is still spreading," Margaret observed with satisfaction. Daniel's reputation as a builder has brought almost as much attention as your reputation as a teacher. The comment highlighted one of the unexpected developments of recent months. Daniel's skills had become widely known throughout the territory, leading to offers of work that would have taken him far from the Miller Ranch. But he had declined them all, choosing to focus his efforts on the school project and the future he was building with Sarah. As the visitors dismounted and began examining the construction site, Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. Each new family that expressed interest in the school represented both validation of their vision and increased pressure to deliver on their promises. "I should go down and speak with them," she said, reaching for her shawl and the walking stick. That had become less a symbol of limitation and more simply a practical tool. The conversation with the visiting families proved both encouraging and challenging. The encouragement came from their obvious enthusiasm for the educational opportunity being created. Parents spoke passionately about their children's need for proper schooling and their willingness to make significant sacrifices to provide it. The challenge came from the complexity of their requests and expectations. Some wanted classical education, emphasizing Latin and literature. Others prioritized practical skills like mathematics and natural sciences. Several families inquired about religious instruction, while others specifically requested secular curricula. "We'll need to find ways to accommodate different educational philosophies," Sarah explained to Daniel later that afternoon as they walked through the construction site together. "It's clear that one approach won't satisfy everyone's needs." Daniel paused in his examination of the foundation stones they had laid the previous week, considering her words carefully. "Maybe that's actually an advantage," he suggested. "If we can demonstrate that different approaches can coexist successfully, we'll be offering something truly unique in this territory." The insight was typical of Daniel's ability to find opportunity within apparent obstacles. Over the months they had worked together on the school project, Sarah had come to deeply appreciate his capacity for creative problem-solving and his unwavering optimism about their shared endeavors. Their relationship had deepened naturally during the long winter months, built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the kind of partnership that emerges when two people discover they can accomplish together what neither could achieve alone. But they had not yet spoken formally about marriage, despite the obvious direction of their feelings and the assumptions of their community. That conversation finally came during one of their evening walks around the ranch property, a routine they had established to discuss the day's progress and plan for upcoming challenges. The setting sun painted the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber, creating the kind of natural beauty that made Montana Territory feel like a promised land despite its harsh demands. "Sarah," Daniel began, his voice carrying a note of nervous formality that immediately captured her attention. "I need to ask you something important." She felt her heart begin to race, recognizing the significance of the moment even before he continued speaking. These past months, working together at the school, planning our future, it's made me realize that I can't imagine my life without you in it," he continued, stopping beside the wooden bench they had placed near the herb garden. "I know our circumstances aren't conventional, and I know society has expectations about what makes a suitable marriage. But I also know that what we have together is stronger and more meaningful than any of those expectations." Sarah felt tears begin to gather in her eyes, overwhelmed by the directness and sincerity of his words. The moment she had simultaneously hoped for and feared was finally arriving, and she discovered that all her carefully prepared responses had vanished under the weight of genuine emotion. "I'm asking if you'll marry me," Daniel said simply, taking her hands in his own. "Not because it's expected or convenient, but because I love you completely, your intelligence, your courage, your compassion, your strength. I want to build a life with you, create this school together, and face whatever challenges come our way as partners in every sense of the word." The proposal was everything Sarah had never dared to dream of, a declaration of love that celebrated her abilities rather than overlooking her limitations, an offer of partnership rather than protection, a vision of shared purpose rather than resigned accommodation. "Yes," she whispered, then repeated it more firmly. "Yes, Daniel. I love you too, and I can't imagine facing the future with anyone else." The kiss that followed was tender and full of promise, sealing a commitment that had been building for months, but was finally being acknowledged openly. As they held each other in the gathering twilight, Sarah felt the last remnants of her old self, the damaged, unmarriageable girl who had accepted limitations, permanent fade away completely. The announcement of their engagement at dinner that evening was met with enthusiastic approval from both Joseph and Margaret, though neither parent seemed particularly surprised by the development. Joseph, in particular, seemed relieved that his daughter had found not just love, but a partner who truly understood and valued her unique qualities. "About time you two made it official," he declared with gruff affection. "Been obvious to everyone else for months that you belong together." Margaret was more emotional in her response, tearfully embracing both her daughter and future son-in-law while expressing her joy that Sarah had found the kind of love and partnership she deserved. The wedding planning that followed was characteristically unconventional, reflecting both Sarah's practical nature and the unusual circumstances of their courtship. Rather than an elaborate ceremony that would emphasize traditional gender roles and social expectations, they chose a simple service that celebrated their partnership and shared commitment to their community. The ceremony took place in late May, held outdoors on the site where their schoolhouse was nearing completion. Daniel had worked tirelessly to ensure the building would be finished in time to serve as a backdrop for their wedding, understanding the symbolic importance of beginning their married life in front of the physical manifestation of their shared dreams. Families from throughout the territory attended, many of them parents who planned to send their children to the new school. The guest list also included the construction workers who had helped build the schoolhouse, neighbors who had supported the project from its inception, and even James Hartwell, who had graciously accepted Sarah's decision to decline his teaching offer in favor of creating her own educational institution. The service itself was conducted by a traveling minister who had been impressed by the couple's story and their commitment to serving their community. His remarks focused on the biblical concept of marriage as partnership, emphasizing the ways that Daniel and Sarah complemented and strengthened each other. "Love is not about finding someone who completes you," the minister declared, addressing not just the couple but the assembled community. "Love is about finding someone who helps you become the person you were meant to be." Daniel and Sarah have clearly found that in each other, and their partnership will be a blessing, not just to them, but to all the children who will learn and grow in the school they have built together. The reception that followed was a community celebration that reflected the collaborative spirit that had made the school project possible. Families brought food to share, musicians volunteered their talents, and children who would be among the school's first students played games on the lawn. where they would soon participate in outdoor lessons. Sarah moved through the celebration, feeling overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance of their community. The girl who had once been dismissed as unmarriageable was now surrounded by people who celebrated her intelligence, her courage, and her contribution to their shared future. But the most meaningful moment came when she and Daniel stood together on the steps of their new schoolhouse, looking out over the gathered crowd and contemplating the journey that had brought them to this point. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't come back that second day?" Daniel asked quietly, his arm around her waist as they watched children chase each other across the prairie grass. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think we both would have found our way eventually," she replied. "But I'm grateful we found it together." The observation reflected the wisdom she had gained through their unconventional courtship. Love, she had learned, wasn't about being rescued or completing missing pieces. It was about finding someone who could see your potential and help you realize it. Someone who chose to build a life with you because of who you were, not despite your limitations. As summer progressed and the opening of their school approached, Sarah threw herself into the final preparations with characteristic thoroughness and enthusiasm. She had spent months developing curricula that would challenge students, while remaining practical and relevant to frontier life. Her botanical knowledge had expanded into broader scientific education, while her love of literature had led to the acquisition of books that would expose rural children to ideas and possibilities beyond their immediate experience. Daniel had proven equally dedicated to creating physical facilities that would support excellent education. The schoolhouse itself was a marvel of thoughtful design, with large windows to maximize natural light, efficient heating systems to ensure comfort during harsh winters, and flexible spaces that could accommodate different types of learning activities. But more than the physical plant, it was the philosophy behind their educational approach that set their institution apart. Sarah had insisted on creating an environment where every child would be valued and challenged regardless of their background or apparent limitations. She understood too well what it felt like to have potential dismissed because of surface appearances. The school opened its doors on a crisp September morning with 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 15. Sarah stood at the front of the main classroom, looking out at faces that reflected the diversity of Montana Territory, children of ranchers and farmers, miners and merchants, recent immigrants and established families. "Welcome to Miller School," she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "We're here today to begin a journey together, one that will challenge all of us to grow and learn and discover what we're truly capable of achieving." First day exceeded even Sarah's optimistic expectations. The students were eager and attentive, clearly hungry for the educational opportunities they had been missing. Parents who had traveled considerable distances to enroll their children lingered after dismissal, expressing gratitude and amazement at the quality of instruction their children were receiving. But the most satisfying moment came at the end of that first week, when 8-year-old Emma Morrison approached Sarah's desk with obvious nervousness. "Mrs. Harrison," she began tentatively, "my mama says I can't learn as fast as other children because I was born with this twisted arm. But you explain things so I can understand them. Does that mean I'm not as stupid as everyone thinks?" Sarah knelt beside the little girl's desk, her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously at the question. Here was another child who had been taught to see limitation where others might recognize potential. Another young person who needed to discover her own worth and capability. "Emma," she said gently but firmly, "intelligence has nothing to do with the shape of your arm or how fast your body moves. It has to do with curiosity and creativity and the willingness to keep trying even when things are difficult. From what I've seen this week, you have all of those qualities in abundance." The conversation that followed was one of many that reminded Sarah why she had chosen teaching as her calling. Each child who walked through their schoolhouse doors brought unique challenges and possibilities, and helping them discover their potential was more rewarding than any other work she could imagine. As autumn deepened into winter, and their first academic year progressed, the success of Miller School became evident not just in the obvious enthusiasm of students and parents, but in the broader impact on their community. Families were choosing to settle in the area specifically because of the educational opportunities available to their children. Local businesses were benefiting from the increased population and economic activity. Most importantly, the school was proving that excellence in education didn't require conformity to traditional expectations about who could teach and how learning should happen. Sarah's success was inspiring other women throughout the territory to consider careers beyond the conventional domestic roles. While Daniel's innovative building techniques were being copied by construction projects across Montana, their marriage had proven equally successful, built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose that had sustained them through the challenges of their courtship. They had created not just a life together, but a legacy that would benefit their community for generations to come. On a snowy evening in December, as Sarah and Daniel sat by their fireplace reviewing lesson plans and discussing improvements to the school facilities, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. "Do you remember what my father said that day when the Hartwell brothers came calling?" she asked, looking up from the mathematics problems she was preparing for the following day. Daniel smiled at the memory. "Something about nobody wanting a crippled bride, if I recall correctly." "He was trying to protect me," Sarah said thoughtfully. "He couldn't see past my physical limitations to imagine that someone might value other qualities more highly." "He wasn't entirely wrong about the world's attitudes," Daniel observed. "But he underestimated both your strength and the possibility that someone might come along who could see what you were really worth." Sarah reached across the space between their chairs to take his hand. "We both found what we were worth," she corrected gently. "And we found it together." Outside, snow continued to fall across the prairie, blanketing their schoolhouse and the community they had helped create. Inside, two people who had defied society's expectations about love and marriage and possibility continued building their extraordinary life together. One day and one student and one small act of courage at a time, the girl who had been told she was unmarriageable had become a woman who had married not just a man, but a future full of purpose and promise. And the gentle giant cowboy who had chosen her had found not just a wife, but a partner who helped him become the person he was meant to be. Winter deepened around Miller School, but inside the warm classrooms, minds were expanding with each passing day. Sarah had introduced evening classes for adults who had never learned to read properly, and the response had been overwhelming. Ranch hands, store clerks, and even some of the older women in the community gathered twice weekly around the large oak table Daniel had crafted specifically for these sessions. "Education shouldn't end with childhood," Sarah explained to a visiting territorial official who had come to assess their unconventional institution. "In a growing territory like ours, every person who gains knowledge and skills strengthens the entire community." The official, initially skeptical about a school run by a woman with obvious physical limitations, left thoroughly impressed by the quality of instruction and the innovative approaches Sarah had developed. His report to the territorial capital praised Miller School as a model for rural education throughout the West. Daniel's contributions extended far beyond building maintenance and construction projects. He had developed a practical apprenticeship program that taught older students carpentry, metalworking, and other essential frontier skills. Young men who might otherwise have struggled with purely academic subjects found purpose and direction through his patient instruction. "Knowledge comes in many forms," he would tell students who grew frustrated with book learning. "The key is finding the form that speaks to your particular gifts and interests." By spring, their enrollment had grown to 37 students, with a waiting list of families hoping to secure places for the following academic year. The success had attracted attention from educational reformers back east, and Sarah found herself corresponding with professors and administrators who wanted to understand how a rural school could achieve such remarkable results. The secret, she wrote in one particularly detailed letter to a university president in Boston, lay not in revolutionary teaching methods, but in fundamental respect for each student's potential. When children believed their teachers saw value in them, regardless of their circumstances or limitations, they rose to meet expectations they had never imagined possible. Joseph Miller, now fully recovered from his winter injury, had become one of the school's most vocal advocates. The man who once worried that his daughter would never find her place in the world now bragged to anyone who would listen about the educational institution she had created from nothing but vision and determination. "Always knew Sarah was special," he would declare, conveniently forgetting his years of overprotective concern. "Takes real intelligence to see what's needed and make it happen." Margaret had found her own role in the school's success, managing the boarding arrangements for students whose families lived too far away for daily travel. Her maternal nature and practical skills made her ideal for caring for children who were experiencing their first extended separation from home. The boarding program had evolved into something approaching a small residential community, with students from across Montana Territory living together in converted outbuildings and learning not just academic subjects but the social skills necessary for success in an increasingly connected world. As their second academic year began, Sarah and Daniel faced a new challenge that tested their commitment to inclusive education. A family arrived seeking enrollment for their 12-year-old son, who had been born deaf and had never received any formal education. Most schools would have refused such a student, but Sarah saw only another opportunity to prove that every child deserved a chance to learn. Working with the boy's parents and drawing on every resource she could find, Sarah developed a system of visual communication and hands-on learning that allowed him to participate fully in classroom activities. His success inspired other families with children who had been deemed unteachable to seek admission to Miller School. "We're not running a school anymore," Daniel observed one evening as they reviewed applications from families across the territory. "We're running a revolution in how people think about education and human potential." The observation was more accurate than either of them had initially realized. Their success was challenging fundamental assumptions about who could teach, who could learn, and what constituted a proper education. Other communities were beginning to experiment with similar approaches, and Sarah found herself invited to speak at educational conferences throughout the West. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. James Hartwell, whose original job offer had started Sarah thinking about her potential as an educator, arrived one autumn afternoon with a proposition that surprised everyone. "Miss Sarah, Mrs. Harrison," he corrected himself with a smile, "I've been authorized by the Territorial Education Board to offer you the position of Regional School Superintendent. The salary would be considerable, and you'd have authority over educational policy throughout this entire section of Montana." The offer was flattering and would have represented the pinnacle of educational achievement for most teachers. But Sarah's response came without hesitation. "I'm honored by the recognition, Mr. Hartwell, but my place is here at Miller School. We're just beginning to discover what's possible when education is truly inclusive and responsive to community needs." Her decision to remain with the institution she had created reflected a wisdom that transcended mere career advancement. Sarah had learned that true success wasn't measured by titles or recognition, but by the lasting impact of one's work on the lives of others. Their story had become proof that love sees beyond limitation to possibility, and that sometimes the most beautiful futures grow from the most unlikely beginnings. In choosing each other, Sarah and Daniel had not only found personal happiness, but had created something that would benefit their community for generations to come. Years passed, and Miller School's reputation spread far beyond Montana territory. Students who had learned to read at Sarah's oak table became teachers themselves, carrying her philosophy of inclusive education to remote settlements across the frontier. Daniel's apprentices established successful businesses throughout the region, their skills in high demand as new towns emerged from the prairie. The couple's own family grew to include 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son who attended their mother's school alongside the diverse collection of students who continued to arrive seeking the education that traditional institutions couldn't provide. These children grew up understanding that differences were strengths rather than obstacles, that intelligence manifested in countless ways, and that every person deserved respect regardless of their physical or social circumstances. Sarah's walking stick, once a symbol of limitation, had become something else entirely, a tool that helped her navigate her classroom with confidence, a reminder of challenges to overcome, and occasionally a pointer for emphasizing important lessons on the fond lessons blackboard. Her students barely noticed it, seeing instead a teacher who believed in their potential and refused to let anyone settle for less than their best effort. On quiet evenings, when the last student had returned to the boarding house and the day's lessons were finally complete, Sarah and Daniel would sit together on their porch, watching the sun set over the thriving community they had helped nurture. The gentle giant Cowboy had indeed chosen first, but what he had chosen was not just a bride. He had chosen a future where love conquered prejudice, where partnership created possibilities, and where 2 people who refused to accept society's limitations had built something extraordinary together. The transformation had been complete and irreversible. Sarah Elizabeth Miller Harrison was no longer the girl who sat alone on porches, watching life pass by while others decided her worth. She had become a force of nature in her own right, a woman whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of her physical world. Letters arrived weekly from former students who had gone on to establish schools, businesses, and families of their own, each carrying forward the lessons they had learned about human dignity and unlimited potential. Daniel's carpentry workshop had evolved into a training center where young men and women learned not just practical skills but principles of craftsmanship that emphasized quality, integrity, and service to community. His gentle teaching methods had produced artisans whose work was sought after from Denver to Seattle, their creations bearing the distinctive mark of excellence that came from understanding that every project, no matter how small, deserved their absolute best effort. The boarding house Margaret managed had become a second home to children from across the Western Territories, a place where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Students who arrived shy and uncertain about their place in the world departed with unshakable confidence in their own abilities and clear understanding that their futures held unlimited possibilities. Winter storms no longer represented threats to be endured, but opportunities for the school community to demonstrate their resilience and interdependence. Students learned alongside teachers, neighbors supported neighbors, and challenges became catalysts for innovation and growth rather than obstacles to overcome. The Miller Ranch itself had transformed into something unprecedented, a working educational institution that proved daily that learning could happen anywhere when guided by wisdom, compassion, and unwavering belief in human potential. As the years accumulated like layers of sediment forming new landscapes, visitors came from distant places to witness what many considered impossible. Government officials, university professors, and educational reformers made pilgrimages to this remote corner of Montana territory, expecting to find some revolutionary method or secret technique that explained the remarkable success they had heard described in reports and correspondence. What they discovered instead was something far more profound and infinitely more challenging to replicate, a philosophy built on the radical notion that every human being possessed inherent worth and untapped capabilities that could flourish when nurtured with patience, respect, and genuine care. Sarah's methods weren't revolutionary because they were new, but because they were ancient truths applied with contemporary courage in a world that had forgotten how to see past surface appearances to recognize deeper realities. The dining hall. Conversations became legendary among educators, as Sarah would engage visiting scholars in discussions that challenged their fundamental assumptions about intelligence, ability, and the purpose of education itself. These exchanges often continued late into the evening, with distinguished academics finding themselves reconsidering theories they had held for decades after spending just hours observing how learning unfolded naturally when artificial barriers were removed. Daniel's presence during these discussions provided a unique perspective that balanced academic theory with practical wisdom earned through hands-on experience. His quiet observations about human nature and community building often proved more insightful than elaborate educational philosophies, reminding everyone that real wisdom emerged from living authentically rather than simply thinking abstractly. Garden, where Sarah and Daniel had first shared their deepest conversations, had expanded into multiple plots that supplied fresh vegetables for the boarding house, while serving as outdoor classrooms where students learned botany, chemistry, and agriculture through direct experience. The medicinal herb section had become particularly renowned, with graduates going on to establish similar therapeutic gardens throughout the frontier regions. The original schoolhouse, once considered ambitious for its size and design, now anchored a campus of interconnected buildings that housed specialized workshops, laboratories, and living spaces. Each structure bore Daniel's signature craftsmanship, but more importantly, each had been designed with input from the students and teachers who would use them daily. This collaborative approach to physical planning reflected the deeper philosophy that guided every aspect of their educational community. Sarah's personal library had grown from a modest collection of botanical and medical texts into a comprehensive resource that rivaled those found in established Eastern universities. Books arrived regularly through an informal network of former students, visiting scholars, and admirers who understood that knowledge belonged wherever it could be put to meaningful use. The library's reading room became a gathering place where age and background mattered less than curiosity and genuine engagement with ideas. Music had found its way into the curriculum through the arrival of a pianist whose arthritis had ended her performance career, but whose teaching abilities proved extraordinary. Under her guidance, students discovered that mathematical concepts became clearer when expressed through rhythm and melody, while literature gained emotional depth when connected to musical compositions from the same historical periods. The workshop, where Daniel taught practical skills, had evolved into multiple specialized spaces where students could explore metalworking, wood carving, textile production, and mechanical repair. These weren't considered lesser subjects, but integral components of a complete education that prepared young people for the diverse challenges they would face in a rapidly developing territory. Sunday gatherings in the main hall featured presentations by students, faculty, and visitors that covered topics ranging from local history to scientific discoveries, artistic techniques to philosophical questions. These sessions embodied Sarah's belief that learning never ended and that everyone possessed knowledge worth sharing with others. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.